Lecture Series. There we go, and give a round of thanks. The Shannon Lecture Series is now in its 21st year. It is the result of a generous donation by Lois Long, who wished to support the department's efforts in the field of Canadian social immigration and local history. Over the years, the series has expanded these themes, all the while staying true to the spirit and generosity of this original gift. This fall's edition, for instance, builds on the series' original focus to elaborate themes of voice and methodology, resistance, borderlands, public history and engagement, and Indigenous histories of place and displacement. I hope you will join us for all 5 installments, the next 4 of which will take place in a hybrid format. So for those of you in the National Capital Region, will be held in person at the Carleton Dominion Chalmers Center, and then always available online via Zoom. So there are details on our website, and if you follow the link that will be posted in the chat, you'll be able to get more details there. For the Shannon Lecture Series, it's this series on rewriting Refuge. Tremendous thanks go out to all those who have accepted invitations to participate, including our roundtable participants today who are staying up late, waking up early, doing all kinds of wonderful things in order to be here today. I'm also tremendously grateful to Darlene Moss, Tanya Schwartz, and Joan White for all of their administrative support. And I also want to thank James Miller, Chair of the Carleton History Department, as well as Dominique Marshall, Chair of the Shannon Committee, for their guidance and assistance. And last but not least, I want to thank Steve Schwingheimer, who is a public historian at Pier 21, Canada's National Immigration Museum, who is pursuing important doctoral research on the history of immigration, and who has gone above and beyond in the organization of this series. And those of you who saw the posters widely disseminated for the roundtable today, you will have noticed that there was an image on the poster for the roundtable today, which featured a lighthouse. And a lighthouse is a symbol, right? It symbolizes safety and refuge. It offers a beacon. And this particular image was taken in 1973. 14 years later, after this image was taken, a boat arrived on the shores of Nova Scotia carrying 174 Sikh refugees who were left on the shores. And this event sparked concern at the highest levels of government about migration, control, and the responsibilities of refuge. And so it is an image, when we think about the lighthouse, that actually tells one story, but then the after story was so much more complicated in terms of reception and welcome and refusal. The title of this lecture series, Rewriting Refuge, can be read in many different ways, just as the image of a lighthouse can. And at the core of this series is a desire to ask different questions about the past, with an eye to imagining different, possible, and more hopeful futures, addressing what Teferra, one of the participants today, has described in the context of academic research as recurring cycles of hope and despair. We are meeting today in a world ravaged by violence, hurt, conflict, not to mention environmental destruction. The pain and suffering is palpable, and as the journalist Nasreen Malik joins us in her book of the same title, we need new stories. With this invocation in mind, and given the overall focus of the Rewriting Refuge series, I can't think of a better way to start this series than by engaging with the roundtable participants who are here today. They have all been involved in meaningful and profound ways with questions of research, ethics, methodology, positionality, and many kinds of possible stories that can result from asking different kinds of questions and doing things differently. I'm delighted to invite Marcia, Schenck, Kate Reed, Teferra, and Christina Clark-Kazak to this roundtable. And I think if everyone wants to put on their videos, if possible, that I won't feel so alone as I launch into these introductions. But I will say, I have these formal notes, but I really do want to underscore how tremendously grateful I am to all of you for taking the time today and for the important work that you've been doing, which we'll all get to hear about now. So I'll do a brief round of introductions, and then I'll talk a little bit about the schedule for today. Marcia Schenck is Professor of Global History at the University of Potsdam, Germany. Her latest books are the open access monograph, Remembering Labor Migration to the Second World, Socialist Mobilities Between Angola, Mozambique, and East Germany. She's also co-edited the anthology, The Right to Research, Historical Narratives by Refugee and Global South Researchers, Kate Reed, and that will be the focus of much of the conversation today. She is a founder of the Global History Dialogues Project and the co-founder of HNet Refugees and African History Network. So thank you, Marcia, for being here, and welcome. Kate Reed is a PhD student in history at the University of Chicago. She was previously a teaching fellow for the Global History Lab and History Dialogues Project. With Marcia Schenck, she is co-editor of The Right to Research. She is also, alongside many colleagues, co-authored several essays on the overlapping inequalities that affect the production, narration, and reception of historical knowledge. And so thank you, Kate, so much for being here. You can see I have many pages of notes. Teferra is a learning facilitator and academic coach for the Sustainable Development Tertiary Level Education Program in Kakuma, Kenya. He attended the Global History Lab and History Dialogues Project, and he writes about life in a refugee camp. And we're very grateful to you, Gera, for being here. And finally, the discussant today is Christina Clark-Kazak, who is Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Her research focuses on young people's political participation, age discrimination in migration law and policy, and interdisciplinary methods and ethics in forced migration. So we have a really rich conversation ahead of us, I think. The schedule for this event is as follows. We'll have about 30 to 40 minutes of roundtable and discussion amongst the participants who we've invited to launch this important series. And then we'll open up for Q&A with the audience. So please feel free at any point, if you have questions or comments, to pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or wherever you happen to have placed those lovely icons. We will definitely have lots of time for discussion. And I think the only thing to keep in mind is that some of the issues that we are discussing are sensitive and hit very close to home, and to keep that in mind as we reflect on the roundtable to come. And with that, I will turn it all over to our four participants, with my tremendous thanks to not only the participants, but also our many audience members for being here today and connecting in so many different ways. So big thank you to you all.
Thank you very much for these generous introductions. It is truly an honor to be with you today, and we very much look forward to this, and also, of course, to Christina's comments. So today we're taking some time to talk about refugees and the right to research. And we do this by asking questions about the production of history. So we ask things like, what is history actually? Written by whom and for whom? We pay particular attention to the processes of production, and we will actually advance an argument for the general right of research, historical research especially. So this talk draws on a book project that Laura just mentioned, which is called The Right to Research, Historical Narratives by Refugee and Global South Scholars, and it appeared this year with McGill-Queen's University Press. And we, that is Kate, Gera, and I, speaking from America, Africa, and Europe, specifically from the US, from Germany, and from Kenya. And we'll share this talk amongst the three of us, which is very much in line with how we think about research, namely as a dialogue. So for us, historical research is a form of dialogue with many conversation partners. It's a form of dialogue with our sources. It's a form of dialogue between colleagues, between authors, and of course, with everybody who comes to listen to us, so with the wider public. And we are aiming at bringing together some of the intersubjective and dialogical nature of our work across, and we would like to invite you to share in this dialogue during the Q&A as well. So what are we specifically going to do today? The talk is divided into 5 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the right to research. What is that actually? What do we mean by that? Who do we draw on? The second part is specifically zooming into Gera's work on the right to research in Kakuma refugee camps, so a specific case study. Then we'll zoom out and reflect on the narratives and the narrators with Kate, reflect a little bit on actually practicing the right to research as a form of disobedience, and then conclude with Gera's thoughts. So without further ado, I'm going to start on the first part. So back in 2016, I was for the first time in Kakuma refugee camp as a teaching assistant on a global history course. And that's how I actually met Gera. So this is how far we go back. But the whole purpose of this course was to teach global history, and that is a big endeavor, just as big as it sounds, to students all over the world, and amongst them also a group in Kakuma refugee camp. And we spent a whole lot of time talking about wars, ecological problems, about trade, about health, many, many different aspects, but we didn't spend a whole lot of time on displacement. And so after the class, a few students came to me and said, well, why is this that displacement didn't feature as a major part in your global history course? And moreover, why didn't we hear from any displaced people? Why didn't we read from any displaced people? And so then we thought about a course called the Global History Dialogues, which was supposed to really remedy that and turn everybody who was interested in participating in historical research into researchers telling their own stories, and thereby diversifying the kinds of stories we can tell in global history. So you might be familiar with Michel Rolf-Trouillot. He's reflected a lot on the making, on the production of history, which is something that we then also came to think about. And specifically, he identifies 4 different moments of silencing. So silencing in the way that the ultimate historical narratives kind of resembled for a really long time a certain pattern, because those who were writing history had a certain training and a certain background. And so in his point of view, there's 4 moments. First of all, the first moment is the creation of the actual sources. So in history, this could be oral sources, but this could most often be written sources. And when those are created or kept, there's a first moment of selection, whose voices are deemed important enough to be kept and whose voices do not feature in the record. Then, of course, next level is the archive as an institution. Here we can think about archives as, for instance, state archives, but then archives come in very many different forms. And again, if these are, for instance, state archives, they all come with a certain archival logic. And that logic, by its very nature, necessary to actually sort sources in the archives, comes again with an exclusionary mechanism. The next point would be the creation of historical narratives. And here we can think of very many different narratives, but one example was the selection of the case studies in this global history course that then formed a narrative of what global history can be. And by making a choice for things, we necessarily decided against other things. And so you can see how the historical narrative isn't simply the truth, but it always involves choices about what we speak and what we do not speak about. And then there's the creation of history in the final instance. So this might be the history that we actually, for instance, consume when we read a history book or when we watch a show on TV. And so that kind of then comes already with all these other processes from the source making to the historical narrative selection. And in all these different moments of silencing, we see there's choices being made that influence the final story that we consume. So to counteract at least some of these moments of silencing, we thought the Global History Dialogues program might actually tool up participants with a kind of research methodology that would then allow them to go on and tell their own history. So specifically, this was oral history, because we thought oral history is something that's pretty accessible to everybody, no matter where you are. You don't have to have institutional access to an archive. You don't have to have access to a library. You can basically talk to people that are around you. And so this course, it's called the Global History Dialogues, spends teaching oral history methodology to learners from different walks of life on 4 different continents at 28 different institutions. These are universities, but also NGOs, for instance. And then this very diverse pool of learners comes together, and they actually walk through the whole process of finding a research question on a topic that really interests them, and then doing the research and writing up the project, which they then publish on this Global History Dialogues website that you see on the slides here. And this is also how this anthology, The Right to Research, actually had its origins, or where it had its origins, because all of the people who are assembled here, these are 9 different authors, we all met in this course, Global History Dialogues, and everybody there went through the training of oral history and designed their own research project. And then these 9 authors have taken it much further to actually be published authors in this anthology. So let's speak a little bit about the anthology. For us, there are three important things. We see the anthology really as a form of conversation, as an archive, and as a contribution to the transformation of scholarship. So what do I mean by these three things? For us, it is a conversation between researchers and oral history interview partners, but also amongst the different contributors and with the reader, because you will see when you actually take it into your hands that each contribution is prefaced with a letter to the reader. So there's a direct sort of conversational line between the authors and the imagined audience. But it is also an archive. And why do I say that? It's an archive because the contributors built their own archives, first of all, to be able to do their research. And this is a counterpoint to official state archives. But then the selection of these stories actually is an archive in itself. So the book is an archive. And why is this a contribution to a transformation of historical scholarship? Given the stark inequalities and the power differentials in the lives of the contributors, the anthology is actually trying to be a claim making for material and epistemological changes in the very conditions of production of the historical narratives. And that's why we call for the right to research. So the right to research is not something that we came up with as a concept. Rather, we are actually drawing on Arjun Appadurai. He wrote an eponymous essay in which he argues that the right to research is, and I quote, to make disciplined inquiries into those things we need to know but do not know yet. So it should be understood as a right of a special kind, he says. It's a fundamental ability necessary for meaningful democratic citizenship in a globalizing world. And here, this is what I want to stress. He very much makes this part of global, or rather of democratic citizenship in a global world. So to him, he's speaking about citizens that will use the right to research to make informed choices, ideally in a democratic setting. And this is where we want to expand his notion on the right to research. We want to do this in two different ways. First of all, we want to actually problematize the idea that the right to research is pertinent only for citizens, because there's a whole lot of people who are not necessarily citizens and still very much benefit from the right to research. So there's actually, in our point of view, no reason to restrict the right to research to those who are actually currently a member in a national political community or whose membership is relatively secure. Indeed, the uncertainty and the unpredictability and precarity of life, partially or wholly outside regimes of citizenship, suggests that research as a broadly defined capacity to systematically interrogate one's environment might reasonably be understood as even more important in these contexts. And a second addition we would like to make is that we would like to see the right to research with an emphasis on the communicative, interpersonal, and conversational dynamics of research. So it's for us the process of a conversation that unfolds, albeit unequally, but on multiple scales and in multiple directions. And these include conversations between the researchers and the community they study, conversations between the researchers in a learning environment, such as the global history dialogues, conversations between student researchers and instructors, and in this case, also bridging global North and global South divides within one classroom space, and conversations between researchers and others working in their fields. So if we take seriously the notion of research as a conversation, it becomes clear that a right to research is not a one-sided thing, but it cannot be fully exercised outside of a community. So on our account, then, the right to research is both the ability to systematically inquire into the unknown and the ability to share one's findings and be taken seriously as a producer and bearer of knowledge, something that historically has been denied to many refugees and other people on the move. And this means also that the burden of realizing this right rests not only with universities and educators responsible for training student researchers, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, with the wider community, the wider scholarly community, which must find ways to make its conversations accessible to researchers who defy entrenched norms of positionality, identity, subject matter, and epistemology. And by accessible, we mean not in the limited conventional notion of written for a general audience, but actually we mean materially, by removing paywalls, prioritizing open access publications, and creating programs for so-called non-traditional scholars to freely access libraries and databases. And dialogically, by expecting and taking seriously interventions that destabilize and challenge existing norms, practices, and assumptions. So with these thoughts, I will turn it over to Gera.
Thank you, Marcia. Do you hear me? Please confirm.
Thank you.
Very well.
Okay, thank you. As Marcia said, I'm going to present my study as a case study so that I claim how right to research is important to us. The title I gave it is Right to Research and Moments of Silencing. I borrowed Moments of Silencing from Michel through Marcia. I focus on 4 aspects. First, I try to explain what my research is about. Then I try to briefly tell the methods I used. And finally, I'll try to relate right to research and the moments of silencing. Next slide. My research explored 2 things. First, I did research related to the camp, and I explored the notion of permanent and temporariness. And I tried to investigate how this permanent and temporariness affects our day-to-day life. After I understood the situation of the camp, then I did the second essay, which is related to camp education, which appeared in the Right to Research book. Actually, the research sparks conversation on some points related to the camp, which is associated to so many contradictions, especially contradiction related to permanent temporariness, hope and despair, the politics of day-to-day life. And I try to explore also the different types of service provisions and hospitality in the Kenya in relation to us or we refugees. I also try to explore the learning environment, especially the impacts of fostering education. Since I have been in the education sector since the beginning, I explored how the education landscape looks like. And finally, I try to show some gaps based on our experience. Through this research exercise, what I found out is that the opportunities that I got from this research helped me to understand the environment that I have been in. Actually, it's totally new in terms of depth of understanding that I had before this study. So this research helped me at least to uncover so many of our life issues that we usually don't want to go deep. And in terms of my career also as a teacher and a learning facilitator, I understood the sector well, without which actually I cannot say that I can provide service or the way that I did before understanding the situation was almost like a disservice, not a service. So my claim is this one. And doing a research in such environment and understanding the situation is by itself a need, so that we know our surroundings and do what needs to be done. The method that I used is oral study. Next slide, Kate. The next method that I used is the historical approach, focusing on oral study. That's what I studied with the help of Marcia and Kate. And I used in the interviews with around 21 participants who have stayed long here. I discussed with them, had extended conversation with them, and I tried to understand the context, the changes that has happened over time, the connection between things, and the different contingencies that affect our decisions, the interrelationship between events, the causality and complexity. These are the frameworks that I used when I was studying the camp situation. It is really a powerful methodology. And this helped me to make things very clear and understand the bigger picture of the reality, especially the hospitality, the refugee hospitality in Kenya. And even how the issue of camp came into existence from 1990s and how it expanded, how it has been managed. In terms of education, the different phases of education service that we have passed through, the different institutions that the camp accommodate and the different type of service they provide, the policies they have, the camp administration, all those things have been an issue when we're doing the research. And finally, I came to understand how things are complex, multi-layered, and it's not easy to understand them. So I confirmed one thing: in order to understand our environment, we need to approach it systematically, and we need to have access to resources. Actually, I have gotten all the resources, even related to Kenya, from Kate and Marcia. They are not available here. So I practically came to understand that without those resources, without approaching systematically, understanding our environment by itself is very difficult. So why understanding is important, why we need to have the right for research. Next slide, please. This is my argument. Yeah, practically I have seen that always we have been researched by outsiders, mainly from institutions, universities, or other service providers. But we have been researched time and again, and we have been objects. We have not been primary beneficiaries of the result of the research. We have not been actively participated, except collecting data and feeding them. That's part of the extraction. And we have been listeners of our own stories and experiences. Sometimes we listen those stories in a very surprising ways, because some of them are contradict the situation, some of them are exaggerations, some of them also have some hidden or untold stories. So first-hand or experiential narratives and the second or third party narratives are very different. We have seen them. And the other thing is our caretakers, agencies, institutions have stories, and their stories have not been told, but we can tell in a different ways. All these things push us to do research and claim it as a right. Otherwise, some stories, as Marcia said, be silenced. Especially in the case of camp context, the form of silencing are many. Next slide, please. I tried to mention the different slides in different form of silencing in 3 ways. But before that, let me echo what one of the participants said. She said submitting oneself to different form of assistance eventually leads us to giving away all the possibilities, all the potentials that we have, and we become a mere consumer, and we become deprived of our ability to know and tell our stories. This is how she actually said. We refugees hope for a living. We don't know what our father refers to UNHCR, has for us. They are just protecting us inside. Every decision is made for us. But in the outside world, nobody makes decision for you. Make it yourself, because you know it, what type of life you want to live. She said it in 2009 when I first interviewed her. This tells us that the life we live, the stories that are told are not first-hand. They are done by our agents. We are not we don't have the agency to do such a things. The consequence of this is silencing of some of the stories. In this case, silencing may be by representation. They are the one who, agencies are the one who tell stories. As they told, as they represent us, some of the stories will be silenced. Or the other way of silencing may be by domination. Some narratives becomes dominant and override other stories. Or silencing by perversion. Next slide, please. When I say silencing by representation, what I am referring is that when agencies represent us, they often gather stories and create archives, either aiming at to mobilize resources in order to meet our needs or to show their success. Considering the budget constraints they have, the human resource constraints they have, it is impractical to collect all stories in the way we want. So the stories that they collect is the ones that serve their purpose. In the process, some stories get silenced because their priority or what matters for them is how the stories are appealing to raise funds or to show success stories. Stories which don't serve raising funds or which can't build the image of the organizations become hardly relevant to them. They cannot be archived, at least adequately. In other words, they become silenced. The other form of silencing is silencing by domination. It is a known fact that organizations or institutions have both the knowledge, the capacity, and the power to shape or create stories. And these stories, they are created by organizations with different facts that are powerful. They become dominant and dictate all other stories. And it is very difficult to counter such type of stories. So there is silencing by dominant stories. If one tries to counter them, obviously it has consequences. And as a result of consequence, there comes another form of silencing, which is silencing by perversion. When I say silencing by perversion, next slide, please. What I am referring is that the camp, as I said earlier, it is a very complex place where there are many formal and informal, visible and invisible authorities that contest for different services. Each authorities or each groups, they need narratives to justify or legitimize their actions. So they create stories. Any stories that contradict need to be blotted out or need to be erased, which means in other way, some stories become silenced. Especially if there are people or groups who are incongruent, their life experience, their challenges, their achievements, including the situation and the value system that they have, should be erased or blotted out. So there is silencing. What is bad in such type of silencing is that because false stories or different version of stories created in order to dominate other stories, it creates a void. So it forces to create continuously fake or never-ending false stories, which may mislead everybody, including the creator. So what is my claim? My claim is the right to research has a potential to counter such forms of silencing. As oral history gave me to do something, if we get such type of space and participate in the knowledge creation process and understand our surroundings and do whatever we are doing consciously, we become a storyteller. We become our own storyteller. We become the subject or the actor. Then we get back our agency. As a result, multiple stories becomes available from different dimensions. So the present and the future benefits from that. That's why the right to research is important. Otherwise, what will happen is what Maya said. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. Thank you. I give it back to Kate now.
Thank you so much, Gera. So from Marcia and Gera, we've heard about the right to research and about the challenges and possibilities of enacting that right in the context of Kakuma refugee camp. This is one example of the many different contexts and relationships to citizenship and refugee status represented in the anthology, which features authors living in or working from France, Syria, Kurdistan, Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Burundi. And the relationships to these nation states are reflective of our globally fraught system of socio-political organization. They include refugeehood, official and unofficial migrant status, and varying degrees of citizenship. So one of the questions that we wanted to ask with the volume as a whole was, what does it mean to write history from these different positionalities? And why are people writing from these places so rarely considered quote unquote historians in their own right? So to understand why, we want to think about the category of historian and the assumptions that underpin it. In other words, what kinds of things do most historians take for granted that then become modes of exclusion for researchers who do not have access to those resources, spaces, or conversations? Normal researchers, in quotes, would have access to libraries and archives, to institutional review boards, to colleagues, to trainings and workshops. Many historians have citizenship status and passports that enable us to move internationally. Scholars working in academic contexts have different degrees of institutional support, intellectual community, and financial and other resources. So these are some baseline, very concrete obstacles that people working from contexts of displacement might face. We can address some of these in very limited ways, for example, by creating workshops like the Global History Dialogues Project, by working with learning centers, by expanding access to scholarly publications, and publishing in open access and public-facing venues, by redistributing resources to facilitate the training and research of scholars working in contexts of scarcity and sub-citizenship. But here, if we shift our gaze from the norms that shape our idea of who a historian is to the category of refugee, another set of challenges comes into view. As Gera said, refugees are often seen as objects of inquiry for outsider researchers, whose non-refugee status is implicitly assumed to grant them some degree of legitimating objectivity that refugees themselves are denied. Here I want to draw on research by scholars of refugee and asylum narratives. In many, if not most cases, people in the legal processes of seeking refuge or asylum need to produce narratives of their experiences that justify their claim to protection. The circumstances in which such narratives are demanded and recorded, as well as the criteria that refugee and asylum narratives must meet in order to, quote unquote, earn protection, vary across time and space. But many are compelled to offer what scholar Agnes Woolley has called an asylum story, an idealized version of refugeehood on which the civic incorporation of the asylum seeker depends, and which circulates in a narrative economy that sets the terms for the enunciation of refugee experience. Other scholars have investigated the production of these narratives in asylum interviews, finding that a refugee's own account of her experience is often discredited, scrutinized, and suspect, placed on a lower plane of evidence than testimony from supposedly objective expert witnesses such as doctors, country conditions experts, and asylum officials themselves. The suspicion that greets refugee and asylum seekers' accounts of their experiences extends to the public realm, whereas author Dina Nayeri writes, "Every day of her new life, the refugee is asked to differentiate herself from the opportunist, the economic migrant. The very identity of refugee or migrant is situated within and constructed by a legal, political, and epistemological landscape in which that identity is characterized by the very denial of one's capacity to articulate, let alone produce, quote unquote, objective knowledge." There are two things I want to draw out of these scholars' thinking on asylum stories and refugee narratives more broadly. One is the ways that refugees and migrants are devalued as knowers and producers of knowledge. This is despite the fact that it's becoming more and more widely accepted that knowledge is socially situated and that marginalized people have privileged access to some forms of knowledge. Here we could go back as far as the History Workshop Project of the 1960s and 70s, which was a project to engage working class people, feminists, labor activists, and others outside the academy in writing history, primarily in the Anglophone world. One of the workshop's main claims, as Bill Schwartz writes, was that these people were, quote, peculiarly well-placed to write about many facets of industrial and working class history, and that the people should not only be represented, but should represent themselves. Similarly, refugees and displaced people are so uniquely positioned vis-a-vis some of historians' favorite concepts, the nation-state, citizenship, territoriality, and the labels refugee and displaced person themselves, that their work has enormous potential to complicate, nuance, and destabilize these ideas within and outside the academy. The other is the importance of audiences and publics in valorizing narratives, indeed in making certain narratives sayable, as Gera just shared. The philosopher Christy Dotson elaborates two ways that narratives can be silenced: testimonial quieting and testimonial smothering. Quieting occurs when an audience fails to identify a speaker as a knower, often because that speaker belongs to a stigmatized or objectified group, while smothering occurs when the speaker perceives one's immediate audience as unwilling or unable to gain the appropriate uptake of proffered testimony. In other words, the speaker is communicating an idea that is unsafe or risky and feels that the audience will not understand them, so chooses to silence herself. It is not difficult to see how both forms of silencing operate on refugee narratives and knowledge. Thinking with a right to research can help orient interventions that work against these pervasive forms of silencing and devalorization. First, a right to research would make space for marginalized scholars to produce and share narratives that do not need to conform to predetermined scripts like the asylum story or fundraising appeals, as Gera said. Second, a right to research cannot stop at the production of archives or historical narratives, but must extend to what Trujillo calls history in the final instance. And this means that it implies the participation of an audience that is willing to take seriously refugees, migrants, and other marginalized scholars seriously as producers and bearers of knowledge. For many listeners, these claims may raise questions of objectivity, and indeed it's often on the grounds that refugees somehow lack objectivity that they're relegated to junior partners in research collaborations or treated as sources of data to be mined and analyzed by outsiders. But it's important to recognize that every expansion of who and what has been considered a worthwhile subject of history has been accompanied by similar debates and claims that those people are not objective. For instance, when the history of women began to gain more attention in the 1980s, Bonnie Smith writes, "The history of women and Blacks, it was said, would politicize the field, or these subdisciplines, being sexy, fashionable, and hot, could undermine the truth value of real history by exposing it to influences that operated outside professional standards for what was important." As her account shows, from the beginnings of professional history, so-called real history has been dependent on the existence of discredited voices and devalued narratives. To open up the realm of historical narratives, then, has transformative potential. We see this opening as working across three main levels. One, the use of oral history interviews to include historical subjects whose experiences and perspectives are not reflected in traditional archives. Two, the creation of possibilities for refugee, migrant, and other researchers to produce historical scholarship. And three, a collective endeavor to reconfigure scholarly conversations so they listen to and take seriously the voices of these researchers and their interventions in the discipline. Marcia, back to you.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to try and keep it really short. This one is about disobedience in the right to research. And I want to start by reflecting on inclusion. So it's not difficult to see how a lot of the work that we do is sort of inspired by a paradigm of inclusion, but we think we need to be very mindful of the limitations of such a paradigm. So a lot of the work that we do is actually infused by a profound sense of tension, which stems from the disjuncture between allowing for and even celebrating difference on the one hand, and seeking to participate in structures and systems and dialogues that are actually premised on excluding that which is too different or understood or read as too different. And so there's always this tension in our work, and we must allow for the contradictions, for the paradox and the incoherence in the past that we study. And the same way, we also must actually allow for them in our own experiences and experiments. Why am I talking about disobedience? Well, perhaps it is paradoxical to consider research of this sort both as a form of disobedience and as a right to which all are, or rather should be, entitled. But holding these two ideas actually together illuminates a basic truth: that the realization of a right to research requires disobedience. What do I mean? Briefly, I want to talk about Shema Omar's contribution to the edited volume, because she interviewed female migrants from East Africa to the Middle East and actually in her writings put really long quotes of the voices of these female migrants. And she got a lot of pushback from the editors of her work, saying that her analytical voice needed to be stronger and the quotations needed to be shorter of the oral history interviews. But she actually maintained that she felt this was extremely important because she was entrusted with these stories to share these stories with the wider world and not her analytical point of view about these stories. And she actually went out and she kept a lot of these long parts in the contribution that we share. So for all of us, it requires unlearning what has been accepted and legitimized in the past and expanding conceptions of what research can be to include not only different voices speaking in familiar patterns, so citing the way we're used to oral history interviews being cited, but also different voices speaking with different patterns, worldviews, and perspectives. And the notion of disobedience captures well the ways in which inclusion, or perhaps more precisely, the terms on which inclusion tends to occur into academic spaces serves as a form of disciplining difference. So in other words, in a fundamental way, inclusion is predicated on the possibility of exclusion. And this we see in many concrete ways every single day. Only if you keep, for instance, to the preferred argumentative style and cite the latest research will your publications be able to pass peer review. But what if you live and work in a space where these things are just not accessible to you, as we've heard now? And what if you live in a space where argumentative logic works a little bit differently from the argumentative style in the Anglophone system, or your culture's approach to storytelling varies? So with these questions, I'm going to turn it over for the conclusion to Gera.
Thank you, Marcia. It is raining this side. Do you hear me?
Yes.
There is rain this side. Do you hear me?
We can hear you, Gera.
My conclusion is based on my reflection. I say this: the right to research should not be seen only from the final output of the research, but also from the benefits that we accrue in the process of engaging in research, which enriched me and my colleagues in many ways. As I said earlier, while I was doing my oral history research, I searched for knowledge and experience holders, created a rapport, and listened to life stories, each lasting for an hour, in some cases more. This experience by itself is educative. It was a very good generative dialogue. Analyzing their stories systematically was a very hard but rewarding mental exercise that made me conceptualize what really liminal state means and its consequences. Writing the essay was another challenge and experience that helped me process, articulate, and express my thoughts meaningfully and also ethically. These all have not been easy. At some points, I lost even the meaning of time, space, place, and reality. I got confused. I even felt as if I was licked after eating the wrong apple from the garden of history. But in the end, I got something more visible and concrete. So I say now that a right to research is not a mere claim to participate in research and publish. It is a claim to have a space to think systematically and ethically, take responsibility to investigate one's surroundings, and have some concrete thing to say. Because of my study and the research I did in history, I now have power, many powers. One of the power I got from the methodology I employed, the skill I earned, testing an assumed reality through understanding a given context, mapping a series of events, and digging into possible causes and bringing contingent factors, connecting the camp with other camp experience, etc., has been a very good mental gymnastics and a very good illuminating exercise. that make me now to be a different person. The other power comes from the knowledge I produce. Whenever there is a discussion about camp education, which often happens, now I have something to say that attracts people's attention and influences their thoughts. My essays that circulated around also invoked interest with my colleagues. One of my research contributors, having read one of my essays in the blog, first congratulated me with his thumbs up and said, you know what? I was expecting praise or he would tell me something he liked. Instead, what he said is, I have so many things that I haven't shared with you. I think I should try writing. Of course he can. I know that he's among the few knowledge holders in the camp. The question is, will he get the space? And based on my experience, I doubt the path might not be as smooth as we think. It may require a huge sacrifice. So I say one thing, which is evident to me. In the current complex environment that we are in, the right research is a need for everyone. Even I say it is an essential prerequisite for a meaningful right to speech. Otherwise, you continue echoing somebody's speech. So I say the space to do research is inadvertently, unintentionally, but overwhelmingly invaded or taken by institutions that monopolize knowledge production and those who are providing service around us. So this monopoly should be checked. These institutions should remain as enablers, not monopolizing knowledge production. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gera, and to our roundtable presenters. It was fabulous and so thought-provoking. And Gera, I'm so sorry we had difficulty hearing you at the end, but can you put part of your comments into the chat? So we do have a bit of your transcript, and you were saying such important things about power and knowledge exploitation. But hopefully, Christina, not to put you on the spot, but you'll pick up on some of these themes as we turn to you for commentary. But a big thank you to Gera, Marcia, and
Great. Well, thank you very much to Laura for inviting me and Steve for the logistical help in putting this together. I feel both privileged, but also a little bit daunted about trying to respond to such a rich and important and groundbreaking volume. I also want to state from the very beginning that I am not a historian, although Kate has now made me think of like, who is a historian? And maybe I can lay claim to some of that. But no, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. And so my comments are really coming from a perspective of an interest in methodology and ethics in these contexts, as opposed to from the discipline of history. So what I'm hoping to do is, I understand that I have about 10-15 minutes, but I also note on the call there are so many fabulous attendees whom I would like to hear from, and I'm sure we'll have rich perspectives to share. So I'm going to try to collapse this into about 10 minutes so we have time for discussion. What I'm hoping to do is, first of all, just give general reflections on the overall volume. I wanted to focus particularly on the chapter that Gera wrote that focuses in on education within Kakuma Camp, because I think it actually pulls out some of the key themes that are throughout the volume. And then I have some questions for reflection and to open it up, and not necessarily that they need to all be answered, but more to sort of stimulate the conversation. So the first kind of reflection that I had actually when I first saw the title of the book, that when it came out, and I understand that the Right to Research references, as Marcia mentioned, Padurai's work on this. But what I actually thought of was Hannah Arendt's the right to have rights. This notion that rights are supposed to be universal, but in fact, often to claim those rights, one has to be a citizen. And Marcia, you touched on this to a certain degree as well. And I think the other thing that really spoke to me when I was thinking about this is this notion of universality, because human rights are supposed to be universal. And I think if we take it back to the bare bones of human rights, which again are problematic, but this notion that everyone has the right to dignity and there's a value in each person. And I think that what we see throughout the book is this sort of questioning of what is universal, or the universality. And the fact that, the notion of universality is also socially constructed. Even if we go back to the history of the founding of human rights documents, it's often informed by a very sort of global north, for lack of a better word, notion of what is universal. And in the conclusion, the authors really speak to this idea that their knowledge is situated. And so there's a particularity that we need to think about when we're thinking about universal, but whose version of universality are we kind of centering? And it really made me think of some of Bell Hook's work on sort of centering the margin. And I don't like necessarily this notion of the margin as this sort of like singular place, but instead of thinking about how do we include, it's how do we shift the focus to recentering what the focus is actually, and reprioritizing who has the possibility to make history, and what that the value that is attached to those different places. I also thought, again, reflecting on Hannah Arendt, Hannah Arendt herself was a stateless person. She also is one of, a central figure in 20th century political thought. And so even though we're sort of in this turn in migration studies of thinking of participation and thinking about refugees as writing their own history, in fact, we have historical examples of people who are stateless or people who are displaced who made significant contributions to research and scholarship. And so I think that, again, from a historical perspective, there's a bit of a danger in forced migration studies of thinking that everything is somehow new, or we're in this new era of refugee participation. It's like refugees have always participated. Maybe we just weren't paying attention to it, but in fact, they have always been writing their own histories. And it made me think a little bit more about how I think there is a utility in centering the experiences and the lived experiences of forced migration. And I think we need to do this without essentializing these lived experiences. And thinking more explicitly about positionality and where we're coming, and the diversity of forced migration experiences as well, right? Because, and this is one of the questions that I'm going to raise in the discussion, is around class. Like, I don't think we pay enough attention to class in forced migration studies. And, who has a platform is often linked to the resources that they have, whether that be social, political, or economic resources. But the other thing that I really loved about this book is this notion of research as conversation. So I feel like the conclusion in particular really resonated with me, and maybe that's because I've recently edited a volume where we also in our conclusion had a whole series of questions, because I think that too often, so I've taught methodology for all of my academic career, so over 15 years, and I think that too often methodology and ethics, they're approached as if, this is the way you do things. We have all the answers. You just need to follow these rules, and you will come up with a perfect, ethically, perfect research project. But in fact, research is messy, and research is a series of dialogue. And so I really like the fact that you ended it with these questions, because I think it also allows us to engage continuously in questioning. Right. And to think of research as a relationship, and as a relationship in all relationships that evolves over time and place. And that, we need to engage in this unlearning that Marcia mentioned at the end, because many of us have been trained or socialized into particular ways of knowing. And opening up the conversation allows us to maybe realize where perhaps we need to rethink some of those dominant ways of knowing. I also really liked the introduction to each chapter, and how there was this dialogue between the author and the reader. And I think there also was a real attempt by the editors, but also the contributors to engage in an honest conversation about the structural constraints, right? This is an academic book. There was peer review. There was a tension that happened between, the dominant ways of knowing and trying to fit within that, but also how we can try to push the structures to make it more, and I think at this place, we are at a space of accommodating other ways of knowing. I don't think we're centering other ways of knowing. And again, this, you might disagree with me, but I think we need to continue to push that envelope a little bit further to sort of say, okay, why are we pandering to what we think peer reviewers are going to want? And maybe we can actually push back a little bit more on that process. So I wanted to focus a little bit more on Gera's chapter on, and I thought it was really interesting, Gera, how you had this notion that Kakuma was going to sort of be devoid of books. Like you had to bring your books with you because there was not going to be any production of knowledge or any access to knowledge locally. And I think that this is often a dominant assumption about refugee camps from the outside, but refugee camps are places of creativity, of knowledge, of art, of music. And I think that, part of this notion, as you mentioned, Gera, in even the production of what a refugee camp is to the outside world, it's often dominated by what funders want the outside world to know. And so it's in their interest to present it as these places that are in need of all of these different things, as opposed to as sources of creativity. And so I kind of asked the question to myself, but how can research, but also public education, help to disrupt some of this, but also how we also reproduce some of these stereotypes in our own writing by the way that we present things. I also thought that it was really interesting that the chapter focused on education, and a lot of the issues that you raised resonated with my own experience in Chakatu refugee settlement in Uganda, quantity over quality, but also this reification of formal education. And this then made me reflect on the volume as a whole, right? Because if I understand it, part of the reason why you did this project is to help people to learn methodology. But then I started to think, well, oral history often has roots in many of these places. So why do people need to be taught how to do oral history? Like, is it because it isn't valued? Or is it because you're presenting them with tools, which, as Gera mentioned at the end, are going to empower them to be able to sort of speak back or speak truth to power? But why is it that we need a sort of an external process by which we need to validate something that is actually happening anyway, right? People are in situations where they're in a context of oral history. And I do think that there is a danger. And again, I'm a methodology instructor. and I'm a professor in an academic institution that gives credentials. So, I'm part of the whole system that reifies credentials, right? We want a professionalization of research. But on the other hand, in professionalizing research, do we also then undermine this idea that people actually are experts on their own lives? And do they need a piece of paper actually, or why do they need the piece of paper to be able to then prove that they're experts on their own lives? So this is a segue into my 5, again, very overarching questions. The first one is, and again, I don't mean this as a criticism. I mean this as an opening up of a dialogue, because I've been in a very similar situation with producing this book, Messy Ethics in Human Rights Context, where we worked mostly with non-academics, but we were submitting it to an academic press, UBC Press. And so we as editors really struggled with this notion of we don't need to present everything in academies, but we do need it to pass peer review. So how do we do this delicate dance between honoring, the experiences of people who come from outside of academia and who have knowledge, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, sort of packaging it in such a way as it will go through peer review, we'll get the funding to be able to publish it, et cetera, et cetera. So that was one big question. The second big question, and you've already touched briefly on this, Kate, but I would like to hear a little bit more about who you intended to read the book. Because it seems to me that there's many different audiences here, but I'm wondering, Gera, if you feel like this would be useful for people in situations of forced migration. But second of all, will they have access to it? Because it's behind a paywall, right? And so you mentioned this even in your conclusion, like, and I'm quoting you here, is knowledge a private or a public good? So if knowledge is a public good, how do we then, within the confines of the academic structures and in the confines of the sort of neoliberal university, make this knowledge publicly accessible through things like open access, etc.? The third question is really based on something, Gera, that you mentioned at the very beginning of, maybe it wasn't at the very beginning, but near the beginning of your chapter, which is that you would like to focus on the trees, whereas the editors and people from outside often want to focus on the forest, right? We want to see this as a case study that's representing some kind of generalizability, right? And also that for you, the chaos is part of the whole research process, and that at some point it's important to reflect this chaos in the way that we present the research. So how can we practically, because I'm interested in the sort of praxis of research, like how can we as outside, for lack of a better word, outside academics who are coming into these spaces, how do we honor those chaotic processes? But how do we practically actually embody that in our own work within the confines of this sort of structures that I mentioned earlier? And my final question is really around the role of class in the production of knowledge. Gera, you mentioned this in your chapter, and it resonated again with the work that I've done with young people in Uganda, is that there's almost a universal notion that somehow formal education is going to be a ticket out. So there's this sort of direct but also indirect notion that the more like formal education that's often a colonial education within, certain structures is going to help us advance in the world. But then and also that certain people, even within the refugee camp, are more likely to be spokespeople, to be leaders, who are more likely to be able to get their story out there. And so to what degree can we, again, in terms of centering multiple voices in this, how do we as researchers kind of directly address this notion of class within the research that we do? So I'm going to leave it at that with these big questions.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your comments and for the very, very big questions. I was sitting here thinking, wow, there are a phenomenal number of fundamental contradictions being highlighted. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about these multiple perspectives, is that ultimately we might need to ask ourselves, what is an irreconcilable sort of difference in terms of approach and priority. But I was also struck in your comments, I'm doing that thing where I'm commenting on the comments, I'll just stop with this, in that so much of what you all have been talking about today, you can see the relevance of these kinds of conversations in so many other contexts, both in terms of different areas of research, but also I think beyond, the structures of the university. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And I also, a reminder to everyone that there is the opportunity to put your questions and comments into the Q&A box. And I noticed that Denny has already, I think, picked up on one of the things, Christina, that you were asking. So I'll just sort of highlight it here and then turn it over to Gera and Marcia and Kate, which is the idea of, if we're creating standards around how things should be done, and they're coming from largely, Western universities or global North, however you want to formulate these, what are the processes for sort of moving beyond these kinds of barriers? And I think in identifying problems, we can also work to identify solutions. So I don't know who wants to go first. These are all many big questions, but if the audience members also want to jump in on the Q&A with comments or other questions, please do so. Gera, do you want to go first? Because Christina also picked up on
Sure.
things that I was struck by with your chapter. Okay, thanks.
Sure. May I go?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. I try to respond to some of the issues that Christina mentioned, but thank you so much for the feedback that you gave me. I'll continue thinking about them. Let me start to say something about the questions that you raised. Is it new? There are many refugees that who wrote or participate in research like that. Yes, I have seen that. For example, in the case of Kakuma and Dadaab, there are refugees who wrote about it. But if we ask, when did they write it, where they wrote it, and how they wrote it, we will find that they wrote it there when they reach the global north, not here. So we need to make sure that when we say they are there, they are actively participate, where and how they are doing it matters. So in that case, I don't think that the majority of refugees, where they have been living, they are not actively participating. They only start doing so when that environment becomes available to them. So what we are saying that we should not wait until we resettle or we join there, then participate. That's the point there. Otherwise, we know that not only Haran did or Victor, there are so many people who wrote about it, and I also learned from that. The other issue related to the methodology, especially why oral history, I think that is very interesting. I think that's what we have. If you ask any ordinary person, the only way that to participate is to share history orally. That is the natural asset that we have, just leaving the education and other things aside. If we bring another methodology, that requires a different form of learning, a different form of understanding. So oral history is the simple and applicable methodology to us. But I didn't find it as simple as I said it now. For example, when I was trying to ask stories from individuals, it was difficult because we create so many stories in order to get different services. The story I told to NHCR, the story I tell to different agencies depends on the things that I expect from them. In the process, the real stories that I have becomes hidden in me. Even in some cases, I am not conscious of them. So even that one is not simple to get the story from each individual. Now I'm trying to do some project and collect the stories. That is the feasible one from our side, but it is not as simple as I thought even in the beginning. And the other issue related to the difficulties, the structural barriers that we have, the issue of peer review and other barriers in order to publish, yes, they are there. And I always advocate for open access. And we have had so many discussions with Kate and Marcia. And thanks to them, even some of our products is actually now available to the public. But the issue that we have is, do they have access? Can they read it? Read it not only in terms of understanding, in terms of time, and in terms of real interest. There are so many challenges related to that. So where can we unlock these things? We can unlock it if we have the culture of seeking the truth, understanding the environment. If that culture is not there, why people learn? Why people try to understand? The whole education system is like indoctrination. So we are not prepared to seek or to inquire and understand what is around us. We are prepared only just to accept and consume whatever we are given, either material things or information. The analytical part, or what Marcia said, the discipline of inquiry is not there. So the claim here is to have that type of culture with us. The other important question, which I may not address it well, is the issue of who is the audience. And when I was writing it, I was in dialogue with Marcia, with my professors. They are always there. When I write, they come to in my mind. So I should write it in order to satisfy, to pass their test. Whenever I write, the agencies who are working there, they are always in my mind. They censor me. I also think that my colleagues, what they gave me a lot of information. Should I write everything as they gave me? What will happen? Those things are always in my mind. But my wish is to go beyond that, and the whole public, not only now, even the public, the next generation who is going to you to see that, want to see what has happened here, be my audience. The other issue related to the how to go beyond academics and see show the access and the barriers. I may say like this. I'm sorry, I think it may be a bit arrogant way of expressing it. Whenever I think of the scholarly circle, the academia, when they produce whatever they are producing, the language they use, the discourse, it is with if they want to make it within them. They created their own island. But institutions, as far as I understand, they are meant to serve the public. If whatever they are producing is not, is difficult to understand to the public, now where is the benefit? So that was the struggle we had. Understand the institution, understand the different requirements and so many things. I tried to pass through that. You have seen the tension there. But still I ask, we are not the one, the ordinary people who want to know, should comply with the requirement of the university. The university should relax those requirements in such a way that everybody can in one way or another have access and understanding to them. Otherwise, it becomes a monopoly in terms of method, a monopoly in terms of the output, a monopoly in terms of the benefit of the knowledge there. So which should be deconstructed or decolonialized is not the way we do. It is the university itself needs to be decolonized, and whatever is doing should be produced in such a way that the public gets benefit from it. This is how I responded, but thank you so much for the question. I'll keep thinking about that.
Thank you so much, Gera. Kate or Marcia, did you want to respond, or shall we open it up for additional questions?
Yeah, why don't we open it up, except for I just want to point out that James posted the book is actually available via the Carleton website to everybody who doesn't have institutional access. So the information to that is in the chat.